Jerusalem. Jesus is said to have been crucified and buried in this ancient city. Now archaeologists ask, is this the tomb of Christ?
The most important place in Christianity has actually been ignored.
Examine evidence that this church conceals the actual site of Jesus' burial. A search for the true tomb of Christ as we uncover secrets of the dead.
Deep in the heart of the Holy Land lies the ancient city of Jerusalem. The city is sacred to many of the world's major religions, and its boundaries and icons have been fought over for thousands of years. Muslims, Christians, and Jews all claim control of various areas, and even today, the battles continue to rage. For Christians, the Church of the Holy Sepulcher is the most venerated site. Built by the Roman Emperor Constantine in 325 AD, it is said to cover the spot where Jesus was crucified and buried. Inside the church is a chapel known as the Edicule, which, according to tradition, houses the rock-cut tomb where Christ lay before his resurrection. For many pilgrims who visit the site, it is a symbolic place of worship and respect. But others believe that it is the actual spot where Christ's body rested. Even though Constantine built his church there 300 years after the crucifixion. Yet despite the church's importance, no one has actually investigated what lies beneath the ancient Edicule. The secrets beneath the stones have been hidden for thousands of years, until now. In an unprecedented gesture, the four religious sects that share ownership of the church, the Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Armenian, and Coptic, have agreed to allow a husband and wife archaeological team to conduct the first ever major survey of the Edicule. Martin and Birthe Biddle hope their work will help answer one of the great questions in the history of Christianity. Using endoscopes, computers, historical records, and state-of-the-art heat-sensitive cameras, they hope to discover exactly what lies within the outer walls of the chapel, and perhaps begin to discern whether the Edicule actually protects the real tomb of Christ. Almost everything that is known about Jesus comes from the Gospels, the ancient writings of his disciples. According to these chronicles, in the year 30 or 33 AD, the last hours of Christ's life were played out here, in the ancient city of Jerusalem. This is where he was said to have been crucified, buried, and resurrected. The Gospels say that Jesus was taken out of the city to Golgotha, meaning place of the skull. There he was nailed to the cross, and 6 hours later, his lifeless body was carried to a rock-cut tomb in a garden nearby.
He was crucified in what was an abandoned quarry. And later in the afternoon, because the bodies have to be off the cross by sunset according to Jewish law, Joseph of Arimathea and a friend took him down and laid him in a rock-cut tomb. The disciples simply used the nearest tomb. They could quickly get together a shroud, and they simply put him on the rock bench in the tomb. On Sunday morning, the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and other women came to the tomb to provide the normal burial rites for Jesus. There had been no time on the Friday afternoon. But she and the others found the tomb empty. And that's why the empty tomb has become the physical symbol of resurrection faith. That is why it has become immortalized as fundamental to the goal of the pilgrim.
Christians have been searching for the site of Christ's tomb for thousands of years. And in recent times, there have been claims that it lies as far away as the Pyrenees, or even India. Most serious academics agree that it is definitely somewhere in Jerusalem, but much controversy remains about its exact location. Those who favor the Church of the Holy Sepulcher as the site base their belief on the findings of the Emperor Constantine, the first Christian leader of Rome. In 325 AD, he brought his forces to Jerusalem to erect churches on important Christian sites. Excavating near a rock that was reported to be Golgotha, Constantine's men uncovered several rock-cut tombs and found something that immediately led Constantine to hail one as the tomb of Christ. A small chapel was built around it, and above that, the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, meaning Holy Tomb, was constructed. In the 17th century, since Constantine built that first original structure, the chapel has been damaged many times by fires, earthquakes, and more. Each time it was rebuilt, but many believe that at some point or another, the original rock-cut tomb that it protects must also have been destroyed. The current chapel, the Edicule, which only dates back to the early 19th century, appears to be all that has survived. At least that is what was thought, until Professor of Archaeology Martin Biddle and his wife Birthe arrived on the scene. 11 years ago, the two were asked to do a survey of the present structure, which itself had been damaged by an earthquake in 1927.
We were phoned up out of the blue and asked whether we would be interested in studying the tomb of Christ in the Church of the Holy Sepulcher in Jerusalem. The reason for this was the structure built around the tomb, called the Edicule, the little house, had not been restored, as had all the rest of the church, and clearly at some stage it would have to be restored.
This would be an extraordinary opportunity for the Biddles. They would be the first to seriously investigate the place where Christ was said to have been buried. Their finds raised interesting questions about the current structure, but were not completely unexpected. They knew from previous research that there had been other structures on the same site, so they figured they were just discovering a few forgotten remnants.
By looking at written histories of the building, by looking at the extraordinary range of depictions that exist of the various edicules, we were able to deduce that altogether there had been 4 successive edicules. One, the present one, built after the fire of 1808. Another built in the middle of the 16th century. A third one built early in the 11th century. And one built by Constantine after the discovery of the tomb in 325, 326.
The Biddles continued to find more and more protruding pieces of the earlier edicules.
The same cut happening there. That's amazing.
They began to wonder if the current structure had been built around the older ones, instead of replacing them as was previously thought.
The actual entrance here into the tomb chamber, this is all 1809 to 10. There's no doubt about this. There are these marble slabs, so we know that this marble, and undoubtedly the marble on this side as well, belong to a period earlier than the reconstruction of 1809 to 10. And then we have another marble arch here, actually leading into the tomb chamber. But, I mean, this one here must at least have been the arch that was in position before 1809 to 10.
Yes.
So it's at least 1555.
At least. This extraordinary marble insert.
But if the previous edicules really did remain inside the most recent one, it would mean that each successive structure had to have been big enough to encompass those that were built before it. To find out if this was even possible, the Biddles brought in a consultant to carry out a 3D photogrammetric survey of the edicule.
We took just under 200 photographs in all of the edicule. And these were in stereo pairs, whereby we were looking at the same object from slightly different camera positions. What we have to try and do is recreate the positions of our cameras within our computer model. Once we have these accurately positioned, we can then start taking measurements from each of the photographs. This gives us the ability of viewing these in 3D, and therefore being able to take three-dimensional measurements from them. The results of this are a highly accurate model that is accurate to a few millimeters.
Once Littleworth had finished the model of the 19th century edicule, he used dimensions gathered from original plans and drawings to create scaled 3D images of each of the earlier chapels. From the 4th century, the 11th century, and finally, the 16th century.
The point of creating models of the previous structures was to see how they fitted within the present structure. Once we superimposed them, we found that the 11th century fitted over the 4th century structure, the 16th fitted over the 11th century structure, and finally the present edicule fitted over the 16th century structure.
This was an exciting revelation for the Biddles. If the earlier structures that had been built over the tomb were still there, then there was a chance that the tomb itself was too. Constantine had seen it in the 4th century, and there were also later detailed accounts of what it looked like.
Next, Ancient Tuesdays on History Television.
The Biddles' archaeological survey, 3D mapping, and careful historical research had turned up a potential breakthrough. They now have reason to believe that the tomb found by Constantine, and long thought to have been destroyed, may still remain beneath the present-day edicule. But even if the tomb does still exist, is there any way to determine whether it had actually been Christ's? The Biddles' first step is to find out exactly what a tomb from that era would have looked like. The Hinnom Valley lies just outside the old city walls of Jerusalem. This is the place where Judas Iscariot was thought to have committed suicide after he betrayed Jesus. The valley is full of old limestone quarries, among which are dozens of ancient tombs. The Biddles have come here with Dan Bahat, an expert on Jewish burial customs, to see if these tombs can offer clues about the burial of Jesus.
Fantastic. Imagine when it was not so built as it is today.
I mean, all this is illegal, really.
The Greek Orthodox monastery of Onufrius is perched on the side of the valley. Beneath it are many ancient tombs, and although none are candidates for the actual tomb of Christ, they are from the same period and can show what Christ's tomb probably looked like. The outer chambers contain the bodies of early monks who lived and died in these caves several centuries after the time of Christ. They give a graphic illustration of how people were laid to rest in rock-cut tombs. But these platforms are larger than Christ's. which the Gospels say had a single bench, only big enough for one body. Further inside the complex, Dan shows the Biddles a more accurate example.
That really does give you the feel of a small rock-cut tomb.
And
bench to the
rock-cut
right,
bench, yes.
And
Bench to the right, exactly
Yes.
as the sepulchre itself.
When one's actually in the tomb chamber, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that is what, however eroded and broken, is covered by the marble slabs and by the burial slabs. So that's what, that really is a shelf, a rock-cut shelf in a rock-cut tomb.
With a clear picture of what tombs from Christ's time looked like, and growing evidence that a rock-cut tomb may still exist within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Biddles turned to the biggest mystery of all. How did Constantine really know that the tomb over which he built his chapel was the actual tomb where Christ was buried? Jerusalem has been called the City of the Dead. In and around its ancient walls lie thousands of tombs dating back many centuries. Amidst the multitude of anonymous tombs, how is it possible for Constantine to determine exactly which one belonged to Jesus, 300 years after the crucifixion? Were there any special features that helped him identify it? The most direct historical descriptions of Christ's burial are found in the Gospels. They tell that Jesus was crucified on a Friday outside the city walls, in a rocky area called Golgotha, the place of the skull. By applying the Gospels to old plans and excavations under the city, archaeologists have pieced together details of the route Christ probably took to his death.
Eventually he would have come to a gate. We don't know how long that walk took. It's an angle gate. He would have had to struggle through 2 right-hand turns before he came out into the open. And then he would have been just on the edge, the eastern edge of a quarry. And there, just below the walls, on a little hill, which had been eroded into 2 eyes so that it looked like a skull, there he would have been crucified.
The Gospels tell that as Jesus hung from the cross, the skies grew dark, and he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He is said to have suffered for 6 hours before finally uttering his last words, "It is finished." At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he died and was taken down from the cross. Rushing to beat the Sabbath, 2 disciples carried him away and prepared his body for burial. He was sprinkled with dry spices and wrapped in a linen cloth. Then he was laid to rest in a rock-cut tomb close to the site of the crucifixion. The salient points for the Biddles' investigation are that Jesus was crucified outside the city walls, in a rocky area beneath a skull-shaped stone, and that he was buried in a rock-cut tomb within a garden close by. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is traditionally seen as fitting this description, because it is thought to contain not only a tomb, but also a rock that marks the spot where Golgotha once was. This altar is said to cover the actual rock of Golgotha and stands 39 yards from the edicule under which Christ's tomb is thought to be. For those who believe this is the actual place where Christ was crucified, it is a most holy site for worship. But many believe that Constantine picked the wrong spot when he built the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, and that Christ's actual tomb lies elsewhere in Jerusalem. Some have thought it is at this spot, known as the Garden Tomb. In many ways, the Garden Tomb seems to match the words of the Gospels exactly. It lies in a garden, close to a cliff face that looks like a skull. And it also fits the Gospels in one way that the Holy Sepulcher does not. It lies outside the city walls.
You are watching Ancient History Tuesdays on History Television. The past comes to life on History on Film, Saturday, at the height of vision.
The Garden Tomb was discovered by General Gordon of Khartoum in the 19th century. He made his discovery after finding a rock formation that matched the Gospel's description of Golgotha. Gordon had questioned the authenticity of the tomb beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because of its location inside Jerusalem. He was looking for a site outside the city walls.
He was a student of the Bible, studying what the Bible was actually saying about the places, and came to look at where the bus station now stands outside our garden, and he became increasingly convinced that that was in fact Golgotha. That area up there was known as Skull Hill before the time of Gordon, and therefore he and others were looking all around this area for a tomb that fitted the details of the New Testament about the tomb of Jesus. And just remember that the person who took down the body of Jesus from the cross was a rich man, Joseph of Arimathea, and he had this tomb nearby. It has to be a Jewish tomb, and some of our visitors who come here and say, but Jesus, surely it was a Christian tomb. Jesus, of course, lived and died and was buried as a Jew and buried in a Jewish tomb. So a rich man's Jewish tomb from the time of Jesus in a garden setting, a tomb, in fact, which could have been sealed by a rolling stone. You can imagine a very large stone being placed here in the groove and then rolled across to seal the entrance to the tomb. So it does fit all the details of the Bible about the tomb of Jesus.
Inside, evidence that this was the right tomb appeared even stronger.
First of all, one of the features we've got here is the pillow there where the head could have rested, and a place cut out of the rock down there for the feet. But we've also got a second tomb over here, and the interesting thing is that this one, although it's got a place for the head, there's no place cut for the feet. And Jesus, you remember, was buried in a new tomb, a tomb wherein man had not yet lain. One of the features in those days was that although they'd constructed the tomb, they only cut the place for the feet when they saw the size of the person to be buried. Therefore, we know that this one has been used, place for the head, place for the feet, whereas this one may not have been used at that stage. So having it all fitting together, a rich man's Jewish tomb in a garden setting, so close to a possible crucifixion site, I think you can see why people felt that this could indeed be the actual tomb of Jesus.
As convincing as the case for the Garden Tomb might seem, most archaeologists now doubt its authenticity. They believe that many of the physical characteristics of the tomb are not consistent with the period when Jesus was buried.
The Garden Tomb is a very lovely place and many people appreciate it. The difficulty is that the features of the tomb simply don't fit with the tomb of the period of Jesus, of the 1st century AD. Archaeologists who've studied the Jewish tomb in Jerusalem believe it belongs to a period perhaps 7 or 8 centuries earlier, and the groove outside it, which is pointed out as a groove for a rolling stone, is unlike any other rolling stone groove in Jerusalem. It's probably, in fact, a Crusader water channel.
So despite the many similarities, it would seem that the Garden Tomb could not have been the place where Christ was buried. But it still had one important characteristic that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre did not: its location.
It would have to be outside the city wall. And once Jesus had been sentenced to death, he, as you know, carried his cross outside the city wall to the place in Aramaic called Golgotha, the place of the skull. And that would have been an open space where a lot of people could have seen the crucifixion. Just to remind you that crucifixion was a deterrent form of punishment. They wanted robbers, malefactors to see what was going on and learn the appropriate lesson. So it was an open place, probably by the roadside. We know for sure that this area here was outside the city wall. The Holy Sepulcher may not have been.
This one factor casts a long shadow over the theory that Christ's tomb lies beneath the edicule in the church. Had Constantine been mistaken when he chose that site?
The location of the Church of the Holy Sepulcher has caused people a lot of worry because the Gospels say he was taken out of the city, in other words, to the place of crucifixion. But of course, as you can see, the great dome covering the tomb of Christ and the place of Golgotha, the crucifixion just to the right of it, are very obviously completely inside the city today.
But perhaps that was not the case when Christ was alive.
It is the city which has moved. It's possible to look down on the city and see where the walls lay at the time of Jesus. You can see today that the roofs of the building on the right are higher and the roofs of the building on the left are lower. And that difference between the high roofs to the right of buildings inside the line of the wall and low roofs to the left of buildings outside the line of the city wall give us the line of the north wall of the city as it was in the time of Jesus. And it was only with the extension of the city walls to the west and to the north, about 10 years only after the time of the crucifixion, that the traditional site was brought within the city, which is why the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is within the walls of the city today.
So at the time Christ was buried, the spot where the church would later be built was actually outside the city. It was not until 41 AD that Jerusalem expanded to where the walls now stand. So what initially looked like a contradiction can be explained by the growth of the city, further supporting the theory that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built over Christ's actual tomb. But the Biddles believe they can find even more substantial evidence. They know that Christ was buried as a Jew, so they are looking for an indication that the tomb beneath the church was a Jewish one. Archaeologists know that ancient Jewish tombs were often cut into the sides of former quarries, and the Gospels themselves mention Jesus was crucified on the eastern edge of a quarry. If there is evidence of a quarry beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it would be one more sign that the tomb could have been Christ's. John Seligman of the Israeli Antiquities Authority has studied the church in detail. He has found clear evidence that it was, in fact, built above an ancient quarry.
Now, we're standing within a quarry, very clearly shown by the sort of marks that we can see on the ceiling. The ceiling shows where the stones have been removed from the quarry, leaving these marks of the block sizes that were cut from the quarry itself. Now, the walls of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre are built within the quarry marks. So therefore, the building has to be after the quarry has been actually exhausted. The quarrying system was to cut a channel around the stone, and then with a diagonal cut, to then place a wedge, a metal wedge behind it, and then hit it with a hammer, and the stone would then come away. That was the system of quarrying that we know to have been used during the 1st century from other sites. And so there is therefore a possibility that this quarry is either from the 1st century, the time of Jesus, or a little bit time before that, which of course is the right chronological relationship that we're looking for.
Not only is the chronology of the quarry right, there are also some remarkable 1st century tombs within the catacombs. The most important of these lies deep inside. Oral tradition has it that Joseph of Arimathea was buried here. Joseph is said to have supplied the tomb for Jesus, and his grave lies only yards from the edicule.
We're now within the tomb that's traditionally attributed to Joseph of Arimathea, which is in the back part of the Holy Sepulchre, about 15 meters from the tomb of Christ. Now this tomb is a typical tomb of the first century before Christ until the first century after Christ. Within the space of the church we have the tomb, the quarry and the Golgotha. All those three things together give us the sort of site that could well have been used for the tomb of Christ.
And the date the tomb was created can be fine-tuned even further. Under Jewish law, burials had to be outside city walls. But records show that Jerusalem expanded over the site of the Holy Sepulcher in 41 AD. Therefore, the very latest the tombs beneath the church could have been constructed was 10 years after Christ's death.
You are watching Ancient History Tuesdays on History Television.
The Church of the Holy Sepulcher seems to have all the landmarks of Christ's burial place. But in 325 AD, what allowed the Emperor Constantine to identify that exact tomb amid the rubble and thousands of other tombs? In the years immediately after the crucifixion, Christ's tomb may have been easily recognizable. But in the 2nd century, it was completely buried by the Emperor Hadrian, who built a temple to the Roman gods on the site. The Biddles believe that a reference to Golgotha in a 3rd century book means that part of the stone must still have been visible. But others disagree and think that from the time Hadrian built his pagan temple, the site was completely covered and forgotten. 200 years later, they say, when Constantine began searching, there would have been no way to identify the site. These critics believe Constantine could have picked any tomb in any quarry. He had recently made Christianity the favored religion of Rome and had political reasons for wanting to discover the site.
Constantine was creating a new official religion which had to look back in its roots. This religion had to go back to its origins, and it had to create foundations that they would be visible to the world. The tomb had to be discovered, and it was discovered in the middle of the city of Aelia Capitolina, a pagan city, and the church was built over it to show to the world that this is the center of Christianity, and really it had become visible that there was a victory here, a Christian victory over the pagans.
I think such criticism of Constantine that he needed a tomb for political reasons, so he invented a tomb. Now that's purely gratuitous. I mean, there's not the slightest bit of evidence for that. What I believe is that there was a consistent memory in Jerusalem. Christians, of course, who venerated Jesus as a holy man, they certainly, in keeping with the customs of their age, they would have gone to pray at his tomb, so they knew exactly where it was. And when Hadrian built this temple to Juno, Jupiter, and Minerva, the Capitoline temple, right over that site, then, of course, the Christian memory in Jerusalem was intensified by bitterness. He excluded their visits to the tomb of their holiest person. Then subsequently, when visitors came, they were told, I presume with great anger, it's under there, right in the middle of the city. That's where he was crucified, that's where he was buried, and look, we can't get there.
But even with directions from local Christians, what made Constantine certain he had found precisely the right burial chamber when he dismantled the pagan temple and dug down into the cemetery? What did he find that made him sure he had uncovered Christ's actual tomb? Was there something about the tomb that differentiated it from the others that were discovered here? The historian Eusebius, who saw the tomb when it was unearthed, said it provided clear and visible proof of Christ's resurrection. What clue had he seen? The Biddles believe they might find the answer not in Jerusalem, but here, in the ancient city of Rome. Like the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, Roman catacombs beneath the city were important sites of religious pilgrimage for early Christians. People came to pray near the bodies of early popes and saints. Professor Biddle believes that in addition to the bodies, these Roman tombs hold a clue that would have allowed Constantine to identify Christ's tomb back in Jerusalem 300 years after the crucifixion took place.
This is the crypt of the popes in the Catacomb of St. Callistus, about 40 feet underground, just outside the walls of Rome. Now, just outside the entrance of this crypt are walls with plaster still surviving on it, and this plaster is covered with hundreds of scratched inscriptions, with graffiti, if you like. Not only are they up and down the wall, but they're one on top of another in different hands and different styles over a long period of time. The reason that I wanted to look at this is because I think that in Jerusalem, when the tomb of Christ was uncovered in 325 or 326, what led Eusebius to identify it so confidently as the tomb of Jesus, as the place of the resurrection, was that the walls outside were covered with graffiti, just like these. One of the most extraordinary inscriptions here, I think, is this one, which says, Jerusalem civitas et ornamentum, Jerusalem, city and ornament, martyrum Dei, of the martyrs of God. It takes us right back to Jerusalem, but what takes us even closer is that here, just very faintly, between Jerusalem and the word ornamentum, somebody in a later hand has written in Greek, Anastasis, the resurrection. It shows how these ideas, although we may be in Rome, they're all part of a commonalty of Christian behavior, of visiting the places of saints and martyrs, visiting the rock-cut tomb of Jesus, leaving their prayers and their names in graffiti.
Professor Biddle believes the same would have been true in Jerusalem.
The whole idea, of course, being that the saints and martyrs are physically present in this place where their bodies lie, as well as in heaven, so that they form a bridge between earth and heaven and can carry the...
So perhaps here in the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, deep within the ornate outer shell of the edicule, lies a rock-cut tomb whose entrance is scratched with prayers and dedications that identify it as the tomb of Christ. Outside the church, this tradition of Christian graffiti can be seen on the 12th century columns that tower over the entrance. Here, hundreds of pilgrims and crusaders have scratched their prayers into the stones. If the Biddle's theory is right, and the tomb beneath the edicule was marked in a similar fashion, Constantine would have found evidence that the burial chamber he uncovered and then enshrined really did belong to Christ. But it will take modern technology and the removal of much red tape to give the Biddles the opportunity to prove they are correct. In an unprecedented gesture, the various church authorities allow the Biddles to call in a structural archaeologist who uses thermal imaging and endoscopic cameras to look through old buildings and reveal their inner layers. Robert Demas expects the pictures he takes to give a clear indication of any structure hidden within the edicule. At long last, the Biddles will have the chance to look for the actual tomb that they believe is there, and to prove that their earlier three-dimensional models of the edicules were correct. When they began their initial research, they thought all that existed of the edicule was the most recent 19th century chapel. But since then, they have found much evidence that the chapels were actually constructed like nested Russian dolls, with 4 successive structures from the 4th, 11th, 16th, and 19th centuries, built one outside the other. With his endoscopic camera, Damas will be the first person to actually look inside the walls of the edicule.
Next, ancient inscriptions may lead to the tomb of an Alliance Atlantis network.
Damas's endoscopic camera works within the walls, but his thermal imaging system takes longer to reveal its secrets. He will have to stay overnight to collect thermal photographs that can detail the hidden structures. The church is closed for the evening, but Damas stays behind. This is the best time for him to work, as he will get the clearest images of the edicule once the body heat from the day's visitors has dissipated.
This works to some extent like an ordinary video camera, but we're looking at wavelengths and the infrared range rather than visible light. And by that, we're able to detect very small variations in temperature. If you think of photography as looking at variations in shade and light, then thermography is basically looking at variations in heat and cold. Now, obviously, with light, you can see the variations with the naked eye, but with infrared radiation, you have to use a very specific camera to pick up that particular wavelength of energy, and that's what this camera does. The back of the thermal imaging camera has to cool down to minus 175 centigrade. This enables it to be extremely sensitive to tiny variations. This particular camera, which is the most sensitive portable camera available on the civilian market, is able to detect differences as small as 0.025 of a degree. And particularly when we're looking at a building like this, where there are very small temperature changes through the day and through the night and between different elements of the building, that ability to pick up very small changes is most important. I'm looking always for changes in the temperature and the way that the heat is flowing out of the panels. Those with a lower mass will tend to cool down more quickly, and those which have bigger mass or are attached to other structure behind will tend to hold their heat longer.
Damas hopes the camera will reveal some of the inner structure of the edicule, but his pictures will have to be processed and carefully analyzed before he can be sure he has succeeded. It takes about a month before he is ready to reveal his results. He meets the Biddles in England to show them what he has found.
Well, yeah, I mean, with the sort of stuff that you're using, you're probably better off.
The thermal pictures from the church show that there is at least one completely separate building within the 19th century outer shell, just as the Biddles had suspected.
It is a separate structure, if you like. The visible areas of the edicule don't seem to be relating to what's going on behind. And when we started looking through with endoscopes, that certainly confirmed that there was no visible connection between the outer skin and what we could see of what was inside.
It felt exactly like
the endoscope videos corroborate what the thermal images were indicating, that there were inner walls within, but separate from, the most recent outer structure.
Check with this. This isn't an area that's actually moved out very much.
Excellent. So there's physically air between the outer skin.
Everywhere we look, there's physically air or very loose, crumbly material.
That's quite good.
Now, if that's the case, the inner, by definition, is going to be earlier. And these walls are so thick, as the photogrammetric plan shows, and the skin is so thin, that there is a tremendous amount of space, which now I think we can be sure of, does include the remains of earlier edicules and
the other side of
the results from the thermal and endoscopic imaging confirm the Biddles' theory that the remains of earlier structures still exist within the current edicule. And they also provide evidence that there really may be a rock-cut tomb beneath the chapels. The thermal camera shows heat as red and cool as yellow. On the left side, where the tomb should be, the temperature seems hotter. This could indicate the presence of the actual burial chamber. Once again, the endoscope reveals more details.
quite clearly in several places we can see cut stone, possibly even living rock from which the original tomb was cut. It's a remarkable result, Robert. There's much to do, but my goodness, what a step forward.
The cameras have delved farther inside the edicule than anyone has ever gone, and revealed strong evidence that the tomb exists within. But for now, there is no way to actually see what remains. However, like the rest of the church, the crumbling edicule will one day need to be renovated. And when that time comes, the Biddles are certain that at least part of the actual tomb of Christ will be found.
The exciting and extraordinary thing is that after 11 years of developing ideas about the tomb of Christ in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, we seem to see these ideas coming true. There is a rock-cut tomb surviving in some way inside the present edicule. There are remains of earlier edicules. And the whole tradition of the site, whether it's place names or historical evidence, is that this is indeed the original rock-cut tomb of Christ.